Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be going through Module 2.2, and specifically we're going to be looking at the study of population ecology. So in our last lecture we were looking at the study of ecology generally and understanding the different levels that ecologists study and operate at. So today we're going to be zooming in on population level ecology and understanding a lot of the terminology and definitions that ecologists use to specifically describe populations. So as always, we're going to start with a scientific figure of something that's currently happening in population ecology. If you hear my cat squeak, she's about and excited because it's nighttime and she loves to talk. I got nothing. So this study was by Jesus Alonso Panimai, and he was specifically studying Norway rats, which is your common city rat, in Brazilian urban slums. Now, why study urban rats? And it turns out urban rats are the primary reservoir of a bacteria called Leptospira. And when this is contracted by humans, it becomes a very serious illness called leptospirosis. So he wanted to understand how populations were cycling in these Brazilian urban slums, with the hopes of better understanding how rats might influence disease in these areas. So you can see that he did a 2-year study, and he looked at male and female mice, and he first understood the age classes for both the dry period and the wet season. Black bars are for the rainy season, white bars are for the dry season. And looking at how the ages differ in both males and females, you can see that there are a larger proportion of females that are young that occur in the dry season compared to males. And then also looking at the weight distributions over these seasons, again for both males and females. And this is really giving us a snapshot of what the rat populations look like, how they're breeding, and how healthy their populations are. Ultimately, that's what we're really looking at with population ecology. It's a multidisciplinary science, not just, again, observing a group of individuals, but it's really understanding the biology of those individuals, the geography that they might inhabit, the meteorology. So, for example, the wet and dry season, understanding how that might impact that population. And ultimately, it's mathematics. It's really understanding mathematically how a population is healthy or not, whether or not we can predict it to be healthy. There's a joke amongst ecologists that, ecologists are people who wanted to save the penguins and ended up doing mathematics instead. And that one cuts a little close to home for my own work. So one of the key things that ecologists use to describe populations is something called distribution patterns. So understanding where and how organisms are distributed in geographic space. And ultimately, where an organism ends up depends dramatically on the resources and interactions with other members of that population. And for example, in your book, it talked about how wolves clustered in groups because they hunt in pack dynamics compared to moose, which are very solitary and move about not in groups except during mating season. So these are questions that we can start to think about when we're thinking about distribution patterns. Is okay, so why is a moose a solitary animal? Why are wolves pack animals? Why does their distribution pattern matter? Is it because of the resources? Is it because of their interactions between one another? These are the type of questions that we start to think about when we're thinking about distribution patterns. And ultimately, whether or not they reflect behavioral or ecological adaptation, which we're going to get to in sort of a later lecture. So this is just a good overview of some different distribution patterns that was given in your book. So the first one being random distribution. So you can think about this as tree species, or these are really distributed based on where a wind is, where a wind might blow, or where a animal might deposit a seed. So it's very random, it's not well organized, and ultimately the resources that are available to this specific group of trees is as equal. Another type of distribution pattern would be clumped, where you see high density clumps separated by areas of low abundance. So in this case, we can think about schooling fish, where groups of schooling fish confer an advantage because they're swimming together, so they're less likely to be pursued by predators than they would be as individual fish. And lastly, we have uniform distribution, where we have individuals essentially maximize their space between them. And this great example is penguins, and you can see these great satellite imagery shots of penguin nesting grounds, which are very evenly spaced because it allows them to maximize the space and resources within an environment. So these are just some definitions that a population ecologist might use to describe a group of individuals. Ultimately, one of the largest questions that population ecologists deal with is population growth, and really understanding what makes up a population and what things influence that population. So things that influence population growth is growth rate. So essentially the difference between the amount of births that are happening and the amount of deaths that are happening. So if births minus deaths are equal, with excluding the presence of immigration, emigration, we can expect the population to remain stable. However, this growth rate is ultimately influenced by immigration. So as new fish come into the system or leave the system, this influences that total level population. Again, this is one of the reasons why ecologists love islands. There's not immigration or emigration happening, so we're really able to zoom in specifically on this growth rate with the exclusion of immigration and immigration. So when we're talking about population growth, there are a couple terms that are going to be important to understand. The first one being exponential growth, which is essentially unrestricted growth of a population, and it's sort of increasing at a constant rate. I think we all know currently a great example of exponential growth with coronavirus. We can see in a lot of areas of the world, including the United States, we had exponential growth initially of coronavirus through time. However, when that growth starts to level off, we get something called logistic growth. And essentially that's when environmental factors start to limit an organism's ability to reproduce. So an example with coronavirus is we started to have quarantine measures put in place. So that immediately inhibits the virus's ability to contact another host. Another way that we might think about it is the physical environment in which an organism lives. So for example, if you have a petri dish of bacteria, that bacteria is limited to the physical amount that is within that environment. So basically extended only to the level of the petri dish. And ultimately, the last thing that we want to be talking about when we're thinking about population growth is a term called carrying capacity, which is denoted as K by most ecologists. And that's the maximum number of individuals that an environment can support, given its space and resources. So basically, there is a number of bacteria which can survive on a petri dish at any given time. So we can look at this. This is a really helpful graph from your book. We see exponential growth looks like population size increasing indefinitely. And then we have logistic growth, where we're ultimately restricted, and then This dotted line is that carrying capacity. So that's the total number of organisms that a area can support. Ultimately, anything that affects the size of one population could affect the size of another population and ecosystem. And that's where I'm going to pick up in the next part of this lecture. I'm going to go ahead and stop this because we're running a little bit long for this lecture. Okay, I'll see you back in a minute.